You may think that farming is a very important source of food. After all, the entire human civilization is based on the inventions of agriculture. Well, you'd be right, but also not exactly. Although farming is very important in Manor Lords, I would recommend that you start thinking about farming once your village has at least 8 families. You see, farming is not just about farming. The crops need to be processed. And the processing can actually involve several different buildings, which may involve several different families. If you start it too early, there's a chance that you won't actually have enough families to do other important tasks in your village, like cutting timber or building, well, buildings. Now, when you do actually get around to farming, the first thing that you need to do is to check the fertility of the land. So in Manor Lords, each land has its own level of fertility for different crops. So there are 4 different fertility: emmer, flax, barley, and rye. So you have to plan accordingly. If you want to plant wheat, then you have to find area in which wheat is going to be fertile. Now, ideally, you'd want to plant your crops where the fertility is green. Green is always good, right? In my experience, you will not always end up in a map where there are actually a very large patch of green fertility for wheat. In that case, well, yellow is actually good enough. Once you find a suitable plot, the next thing you need to do is to actually build the field. Now in Manor Lord, size does actually matter. So one farming family can handle a field with the size of 0.6 morgen. So if you build your field to that size or the multiples of it, it's going to be easier for you to assign the correct number of families later. For example, 0.6 morgen field should be handled by one family. If you build a 1.2 morgen, then you should assign 2 families, 1.8, then you need 3 families, and so on and so on. I will also suggest that you build 3 fields instead of just 1. The reason for that is because the game has a fertility system, which means once a field has been planted and harvested, it will lose its level of fertility. And for it to recover, you need to let the field rest, or also known as the fallow period. To make sure that your field never actually go totally infertile, you need to plant alternately. So plant one field and let the other field rest. Now with such a system, you may ask, why do we need 3 fields instead of just 2? We can just plant one and let the other rest. The reason for that is actually pretty simple but also historically accurate. The game has a 3-year crop rotation system, which is going to work perfectly if you have 3 fields. What I mean by working perfectly is not only that the production is going to be optimized, but also your micromanagement is going to be very minimum. You need to set up once and then it will virtually go automatic each year. Put simply, the 3-year crop rotation system goes like this. In the first year, we plant on 2 fields and leave one to rest. In the next year, one of the planted fields will get a break. And in the 3rd year, the last field also will get a break. To be honest, I actually tried to build just 2 fields. And when the crop rotation system didn't actually go my way, I was cursing all around and I was blaming the developers. Why don't they just use 4 slots? If they use 4 slots, then we just need 2 instead of 3 fields, so they can just go alternate. And that was before I actually knew that, well, the 3-year crop rotation system was the system that they used in the 12th century, which is, I believe, the approximate time setting for the game. The 4-field system was not going to be introduced until about 5 centuries later. Building the fields is not enough, we also need to build a farmhouse. The farmhouse is where you're going to assign families that's going to work in the fields, and the farmhouse is also the place where the harvested crops will be processed into grain. So now we're going to assign 2 families to handle the work. We assign 2 families because there are 2 fields that needs to work, because one of the fields is going to be rested. Now you have to keep in mind that assigning families and setting the crop rotation should be done on the October 1st. The reason for that is because the crop rotation cycle is going to be triggered on the October 1st. If you assign the families before October 1st, it's not going to go well. For example, you want a field to be planted now, but to go fallow next year. But you set that before October. So what will going to happen is your farmers going to work really hard on that field, plowing, planting up until October. But when October comes, it will automatically trigger the crop rotation cycle and the field will go from planted to fallow. What will happen is simply your field will burn. All of that hard work done with time. So whatever you do, remember to set the crop rotation system on October 1st. Remember that this is only needed for the initial setup, so for the first year. After that, if you set it up properly, the farming process will go automatically each year and you don't have to do anything. So it's October now, let's do the crop rotation setup. First, choose what crop you want to plant, and then set up the crop rotation system like this. For field 1, it's supposed to go wheat, wheat, fallow. For field 2 is wheat, fallow, wheat, and for field 3 is fallow, wheat, wheat. Farming process in Manor Lords consists of 4 main stages. First is plowing, second is sowing, third is growth, and the fourth is harvesting. Only plowing, sowing, and harvesting actually need work from the farmers. So during the growth phase, which is usually between December to September, your farmers doesn't need to be assigned to the farmhouse and they can do other things. But do keep in mind that the plowing and sowing part must be done by the end of November, basically by the end of autumn. So Manor Lord has a season system. If the fields is not finished being sowed by November, comes winter, all of the crop will be destroyed and the fields not going to produce anything for that cycle. Once it's in the growth phase, your farmers doesn't actually need to do anything. So they can actually be assigned to other buildings like windmills and oven, which is actually needed to process the wheat into bread. Your villagers can't eat crops right away because, well, they're still human, they're not actually livestock. So for wheat, it's a 3-step process before it can be consumed. First, it's going to be turned into grain at the farmhouse, then the grain will be converted into flour at the mill, and finally the flour is going to be baked into bread at the communal oven. So, while we're waiting for the crops to grow, it's a good idea to build a mill and an oven. Make sure to build this building near houses. Basically, build most production building near houses because it's going to reduce travel time and it's going to make it more efficient. With the mill, however, you have to know that the mill has an efficiency rating, and the efficiency is going to be high if it's placed away from trees. By September, the crops are going to be ready to harvest. Your farmers will start harvesting and the crop rotation cycle will trigger in October. Sometimes, if the harvest is finished by mid-September, you'll notice your farmers plowing the fields that's not going to be planted. Well, although it might seem unnecessary and quite frankly annoying, just leave it as is if you don't want to micromanage that. And that's it. You're ready to start farming. Just make sure you have enough families working in the mill and in the oven. Other than that, your farming system will run on its own. You don't have to do anything. Just watch as bread is flowing into your ground.